favorable biological environment. So Europeans who are part of this migration become almost instantly aware of the fact that the native population is dying all around them. They don't understand that they are vectors conveying the diseases that are pinching these people along, because the transmissions can cover enormous distances. So it doesn't seem plausible that you're personally responsible for a smallpox epidemic that in effect wipes out the Native American population in the Connecticut River Valley in the early 1630s, and that's what Hooker takes advantage of. But the other thing that they become aware of is that they are living longer than they expected to in England, and the other thing is that their children are surviving at a higher rate. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no infant mortality, but it means that it's much lower, and that's just a product of the fact that people can spread out in space. So it's the concentration of population kills in the pre-industrial world, and even in the industrial world. I mean, American cities didn't have a great reputation before the 20th century, and one of the reasons why Hartford was considered a good place was it was considered healthy. It's not just the insurance industry, it was also considered a healthy place. Brooklyn, the first suburb, is healthier than Manhattan, and you can imagine why. So this looks like a pretty going enterprise, and people seem to think it's validated by the change in the patterns of mortality, so that they feel as though they're in covenant with God, as the ancient Israelites under Moses was covenant with God to bring his people into the promised land. So, but there are some problems, and the problems first surface because Cotton thinks to himself, conversion is just altogether too easy. He begins to wonder about whether it's authentic, and if 60 to 70% of the people who arrive in New England professing the experience of grace, he begins to urge people to think about whether the covenant of works is not replacing what he calls the covenant of grace. And that's what Hutchinson picks up on to challenge the spiritual authority of some of the Boston clergy. The eliminating her doesn't really answer the basic questions that Cotton has asked and which she is exploiting, and that is, how can you be sure of the state of your soul, and is complacency in any way compatible with being saved? And so Cotton gets himself in a situation where he has to rhetorically exhort people to continuously examine their spiritual condition and to emphasize that no one can be certain, that to be saved is to be always sort of tormented, which is because you get, is it real or isn't it? That creates a particular problem. You can live with that in the first generation, but it creates a problem for the second generation. And the problem with the second generation is the first generation was fighting the fact that though they were saved, or they felt they were saved, they might not be saved. The second generation knew they weren't saved. And that was bad. And they're being told to get saved, and they're being baptized in the expectation that the covenant is, there's a bloodline in the covenant, they're entitled to it. And they're entitled to it as the first step towards salvation, but they don't have the experience of conversion. And the clergy, at the same time, are learning to exhort them not to fake it, because that would prejudice the covenant. And the covenant is, has a kind of widespread value because of this differentiation in mortality between Native Americans and Europeans. So that leads to some interesting problems, and it leads to a sense, among other things, of a chronic inferiority in relation to the people who sponsored the immigration. The reason why the second generation is not converting has to do with the fact they haven't gotten in the boat and traveled across the ocean, or it has a good deal to do with that. So you know, the enterprise can carry on that level for a while, but then they have a crisis. They start having children. What is the entitlement of a child of a second generation who hasn't experienced grace but has been baptized in terms of their children? They want to bring their children into the covenant, but they haven't experienced grace. So are they screwing up the covenant by doing this or not? And you know, there's no clear answer to that issue. But what the second generation are doing de facto is, you know, accepting baptism and then owning the covenant as an alternative to grace, which isn't grace, but it's just owning the covenant. And so the reason why this problem becomes chronic is that the first generation starts small. The second generation, the European reproduces like the rabbits in this environment. So the third generation, so the demography is a pyramid like this. And the third generation is down here. If you exclude them from the churches, what do you do to the social relationship of the church to the community? You, in effect, demote it or almost make it irrelevant. So they can't do that. So they've got to bring the third generation in somehow, and that's where you get they get a synod in 1662, which in effect formalizes the halfway status of the people who haven't experienced grace and entitles their children to baptism. Yeah.
Dick, so the experience of grace was limited to their having traveled across.
No.
Is that where their grace came from? You know,
no, it wasn't. Grace was an inner sense of being recreated. I'm just saying that
but the younger ones didn't get that.
To have that experience. I'm not saying that that was the experience. It just created the circumstances in which people felt they had been, resurrected and recreated in the Lord, if you want. I mean, you can, it's just...
Because they had survived. They had survived this.
They had been more of a survive. They had then gone on to more than survive, but to build these wonderful churches. And
so the family, the people who had not experienced that and had not felt that connection.
Now it doesn't mean that no one in the second generation converts. That's not what I'm saying. Although it may sound that way, but the level of conversion is much lower. So it creates a crisis for the organization of the church. Now, this crisis occurs when the first generation of superheroes has passed away from the sea, so they don't have the leadership. And something else happens in 1660. New England could, pass in the sense that they were actually setting an example for the rest of England, and that England was focused on because of the Puritan Revolution in 1640. But unfortunately, there's the Stuart Restoration in 1660, and thereafter New England just becomes irrelevant. And so these people are confronted with this crisis, and without their traditional leadership and feelings of, the rug has been pulled out from underneath them in terms of their world historical mission. So now this is the context in which, guess what, First Church forms. And we're going to get to be open and inclusive. So the interesting thing about First Church's formation is the town at first gathers in 1650, but it doesn't get a church. It starts trying to get a church in 1652, doesn't succeed until 1668. There's a big interval. Most towns do it much quicker, particularly in the first generation. And so it's worth thinking about why that took so long. And I think it took so long for a couple of reasons. First of all, no charismatic leader. Well, that's sort of in the cards. But also, the town, if the original core of a church is any reflection, came from very heterogeneous sources. So some of them were second generation Connecticut, some of them were second generation Massachusetts, some had come directly from England, but they're coming from all over the map, and they're coming to Middletown. Why would they come to Middletown in the middle of the 17th century? Particularly when the local tribe had harbored Pequods, 13 years before in the Pequod War. And I think the answer is if you can find natural pasture for cattle, then you settle there. And there are limited number of areas that have natural pasture for cattle. This is at the bottom of a very fertile river valley, and that's clear by 1650. And they're running out of alternatives elsewhere. And also to have settlements to the north of you gives you a little bit of protection against Indian mischief, even though you're settling next to people you may not entirely trust. So that's what happens. In 1668, they actually formed, 10 people signed this document, and it's witnessed by delegates from the towns as far away as Northampton, which is, I think, enthusiastic, but curiously enough, omitting Wellesley, which is the closest town right next to it, right up the stream. So they could have just floated down the river in a canoe, and they could have attended, but I don't think they were even invited, and that's because Wellesley is not setting a very good religious example. As we should say. So now what's funny is that these guys spent 16 years trying to form a minyan, and the minyan is derives from Old Testament requirements for Jewish congregation. And you think once they've gone through that process, they'd be really tough on future missions. It doesn't work out that way. This is the funny thing about Middletown. Middletown doesn't go the route to hard-nosed purity. It turns around and goes entirely opposite direction, and they word a covenant that doesn't make very many demands on what one actually has undergone, and it just says we're going to walk together in the Spirit of the Lord, and they almost immediately start committing people on the basis of good intentions and a profession of faith, and that's all that's required. You don't have to have grace. So in effect, they're already a halfway covenant as they form, and it's worth thinking about why they came out with this solution. One of the reasons is you take 16 years to get the job done. You don't really want to. It communicates a sense of its precariousness and fragility. You don't really want to take it apart after spending 16 years. So I think that had something to do with it. And as for how this was managed, that's okay. I haven't been able to figure that out. Noah Russell, who is Nathaniel Collins' successor, Collins is the guy who gets the job done in 1668. His successor institutes owning the covenant in 1696 as part of ritual service. But that's a sort of cop-out in terms of purity, but it means it's that's becoming central. I think there's another thing going on that I wasn't aware of in 2001, and that's the way they sing songs. And the old way of singing songs, one guy would line it out, and there are only about 5 or 10 tunes, and then the congregation would murder it. No one got upset about having it murdered. So in the early 18th century, there was a movement in the other New churches to shape up the singing and for people to sing in unison according to the notes. And some of us can't do that even today, but value is placed on singing, and singing in unison means that you pay attention to singing, you stop trying to kill each other over minor doctrinal issues. So I think music becomes a much more significant part of the service in the 18th century. I know that Enoch Huntington, who became a minister here in the early 1770s, was very proud of the church's musical abilities. So that it goes back some way, and it helps to explain why we've stayed in one piece, and we can incorporate people with divergent persuasions in our
But there were no choral, there were no,
Well, hymns come in, I think hymns are, I don't know music, I don't know how to sing, I'm a musical idiot. It was pronounced so at church school, not to sing. So I just don't know, yeah, you know.
Somewhat. I could talk really to Neely Bruce. There was something called shape note singing that
Yes,
developed at
shape
the
note
time, where rather than places on the staff, the shape of the note that was put on the staff, there'd be a triangle would indicate sol, or a square would indicate do, and the congregations began to assimilate the meanings of those geometric figures with different notes.
Yeah, but that would apply to psalm singing, not to hymns. I mean, hymns are now, our central form of, we don't sing psalms. If we have a psalm in a service, we read it. But, psalms have been replaced by hymns, and most of those hymns date from the 19th century and the 20th century.
Now, even prior to that, back into the 18th and early 19th centuries, the shape note, and earlier I think, the shape note lexicon, the way as a way of expressing music was known and was used both for hymns and for psalms in the church.
Okay, well, I think you accept the proposition, but you're filling it out, right? And I defer to your Richard is a musician, so that's, I am certainly not a musician. So anyway, what is clear is that the church survived one of the great spiritual upheavals of the 18th century, the Great Awakening without dividing.
Great Awakening.
And you might say, well, where did the second church come from? Guess where? Weathersfield. Didn't come from here. So we didn't divide, they simply came down. And then, of course, they added insult to injury by dividing 2 more times before the end of the 18th century in 1773. Third church smiled off, and then the Baptist church spins out of the second church in 1795 or so.